All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for the second day of the University of Minnesota Pollinator Habitat webinar series. Today is the second session of a three-part series. James Wolfin will be presenting his presentation, Bee Lawns, Building Lawns for the Conservation of Pollinators and Natural Resources. Just like yesterday, I'd like to go over how we can all engage with each other in a Zoom webinar format. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to ask any questions you have. I'll be asking the speaker question from that section. For any comments, please use the chat feature. These presentations will be recorded and we'll be emailing those recordings out after the series ends tomorrow afternoon. Or I will be actually emailing those on Friday morning or afternoon. Sorry about that. I will also include all the links that will be shared during the presentations in that email, so don't worry if you don't catch them all. You can always watch them later. If you were able to join us yesterday, you'll see familiar faces of our amazing team. Claire LeCan is a local extension educator in Rice and Steele counties. Robin Trott is a local extension educator in Douglas County. Myself, I am Tara Young, local extension educator in Hubbard County, and Shane Bougea, Blue Earth and Seward County local extension educator. With over 1,400 people registered for this webinar, it truly takes a great team to run it, so I'm very appreciative of my team members. And on to James Wolfin and his presentation. James Wolfin is a conservation specialist with Twin Cities Seed Company, where he aims to bring more visibility to bee lawns and sustainable turfgrass management practices to residents and land managers. Before his time with Twin Cities Seed, James was the director of education with Metro Blooms, a Minneapolis-based nonprofit that aims to bring green infrastructure and native plants to our landscapes. James completed his Master's of Science in Entomology at the University of Minnesota, where he was advised by Dr. Marla Spivak with the University of Minnesota Bee Lab and Dr. Eric Watkins with the University of Minnesota Turfgrass Science Lab, where he studied bee lawns, turfgrass lawns enhanced with pollinator-friendly flowers. He is a very knowledgeable speaker on this topic, so we are so lucky to have him to join us today. So we are ready for you, James.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank Tara and Claire and everyone else who helped put this together. I would describe myself as a very proud University of Minnesota alumni, where Marla and Eric are two of the greatest people on the planet to work with, and I'm happy to still be talking about my research today. One thing that I always like to start with when I give this presentation is I always like to make it clear that flowering bee lawns are a turfgrass alternative, and I say that specifically to as not to compare them to a native pocket planting or a pollinator garden, where those are kind of different in their functional uses. We think of a flowering bee lawn as a turf alternative where you can maintain the opportunity for recreation and play and gathering, where they're not of the same pollinator value as that of a pollinator garden, a pocket prairie if you're into lawns to legumes, but rather just what is a pollinator-friendly, natural resource-friendly alternative for our lawn spaces that benefits pollinators and the conservation of natural resources. So with that, I always like to give at least a little bit of context before jumping into this presentation, talking a little bit about lawns, specifically the cultural and ecological functions of the lawn, where, if we're looking from the pollinator's point of view, of course, you want that wildflower prairie, but from the human perspective, we do have some functionality tied to our lawns that not everyone would be necessarily willing to sacrifice. Then I'll talk about the elements of a bee lawn, or really what are the building blocks of a bee lawn. And then we'll even talk about bee lawn installation, where one of my favorite things about bee lawns is how accessible they are, both from a affordability POV, but also from a do-it-yourself kind of project point of view, where if you want to install a pollinator garden or a rain garden, I think it takes quite a bit of know-how. Installing a bee lawn, heck, you could do it in as little as an hour. So let's start off with that context and talk about the cultural and ecological functions of the lawn. So the function of the turfgrass lawn, and that's really why this presentation exists in the first place. So one of the first things that was made clear to me when I was getting introduced to my bee lawn project as a graduate student was I met with Ian Lane, who worked on bee lawns before me for his graduate student research. And he said that kind of the basis of this research is following a philosophy called reconciliation ecology. This idea that we're never going to go back to when Minnesota was, not necessarily majority prairie, but had much more prairie coverage than what we see now. Now we have less than 2% of the prairie coverage that we had pre-1900. Because the fact of the matter is that humans are the dominant life form in our state within our ecosystems, and they're not going away anytime soon. And as long as that happens, the kind of landscapes that humans desire, they're going to be a part of our communities. So the thought process behind bee lawns, behind reconciliation ecology is how can we best meet the needs of nature, in this case, our pollinators, our bees, within the confines of a human-dominated ecosystem. And that's really the basis of a bee lawn. We want to provide habitat and forage for our pollinators within a landscape, turf grass, where humans desire play, they desire gathering, they want to have a picnic, play with the dog, etc. So let's understand just how prominent turf grass is within the United States. These numbers are a little bit old, but if anything, they've only grown over time, where we have about 50,000 square miles of turf in the United States. And if we think about just how prevalent turf grass is as a managed crop, that's more than 3 times the acreage of irrigated corn, where turf grass is the largest irrigated crop in the United States. And if we think to ourselves, where is turf grass most prominent? If you check out the map on your left, the areas in green show turf grass coverage in different parts of the United States. And for those of you who have your critical thinking helmets on, it's probably not a major surprise that if we think about the large metropolitan areas of the United States, that's where we're seeing these big patches of green, where turf grass is definitely tied to urban and suburban communities. Where if we look at the Northeast, you see a lot in that kind of, New York, metro area. And then if we go across the country down towards the Southwest, you see some big patches of green there as well. But even if we look in our nice, humble state of Minnesota, you can see a big patch of green around the Twin Cities metro area and some more scatterings of green throughout. I say this to bring up the point that Minnesota is definitely has a strong presence of turf grass throughout the state. Certainly for those of you in the metro area, tons of turf grass. But really, throughout the state, there is lots of turf. And to me, wherever I see turf grass, I see opportunity, where I view turf grass areas as a huge opportunity for improvements in conservation, where even things as simple as just choosing a different turf grass species to going all the way to installing a bee lawn, there's just so much opportunity here for us to make easy management decisions to improve conservation for pollinators and natural resources. And hopefully today, you'll feel a lot more confident about making those changes yourself. So the basis of this idea is to transform the urban lawn, where we take that traditional turf, which is either a monoculture or a mixture or blend of different turf grass species, add in some low-growing bee-friendly forage, and create a nice matrix of wildflowers and turf grass in a shared area. So I always like to point out that turf grass is still a part of the equation, where turf grass definitely provides quite a bit of value. Where for me, I do a lot of consultations, I do a lot of site visits, both just for myself and through Lawns to Legumes as a volunteer. I hope Lawns to Legumes is something you're all familiar with. If not, I highly recommend giving it a Google search after this. But with regards to the value of turf grass, when I'm looking at someone's lawn and I'm trying to determine what are some problematic areas within the lawn, the first thing that I am looking for is bare soil. Where bare soil is just a huge environmental kind of area of concern because of how it can lend to stormwater runoff. When we have a rain event and water runs through bare soil, it's going to bring all sorts of contaminants to nearby bodies of water, potentially contaminating those lakes. Where me, I'm a New York boy through and through. I moved to Minnesota, about 7 years ago, I want to say. And I knew Minnesota was the land of 10,000 lakes. What I did not know was how many of them were contaminated. So if we want to do our part in kind of lessening the contamination of those lakes, covering bare ground is so important to do. And turf grass, believe it or not, does a great job of that, where the bang for your buck, the ability to cover land for a lower price with turf grass cannot be beat. That being said, adding in some low-growing flowers can ensure that you have a nice, densely planted area that can also provide food and some habitat for pollinators. So we're creating a matrix of those low-growing flowers and low-input turf grasses with a bee. So the goals of a bee lawn, some of these more obvious than others. We want them to be low maintenance, we want them to protect our pollinators, and we want them to improve water quality. When I say low maintenance, you might hear me kind of using the term low input synonymously with that. And here I want us to focus on 3 key traits or characteristics. 1, we want the surface to be drought tolerant. That's never been more apparent than the past 2 years here in Minnesota, where now people are knocking down my doors pretty much looking for drought tolerant lawn options. But the idea here is that if we use drought tolerant vegetation, we don't have to water as much, and our plantings are going to be drought hardy, and they're also going to help us save water. The less we're out there turning on those sprinkler systems, the better it is for everyone. Water conservation is a very, very big deal. We also desire vegetation that has a slow vertical growth rate, and this ties directly into how frequently you are mowing your lawn. With the typical lawn, you're probably mowing about once every 7 to 10 days. What a lot of people don't realize is that with the right low input turfgrass species, you cut that down to maybe 3 or 4 times per year. So that is certainly something that we prioritize when we're picking out grasses for bee lawns, when we're picking out grasses for low input situations. And finally, low fertility needs. Here in Minnesota, we do a great job of that across the board. As a state, there's really good fertilizer laws in place to help keep our applications in check. But when we do apply fertilizers, there is a little bit of an environmental concern to be aware of. The nitrogen and phosphorus that we apply when we put down fertilizers, they can leach out into nearby bodies of water, creating eutrophication or algal blooms, another major contributor to that deteriorating water quality we see in some lakes, rivers, etc., across the state. That being said, not every turfgrass has the same fertilizer requirement. In fact, some low input turf grasses have about 1/6 the fertilizer requirement as the more high input, high maintenance species. So this is all going to become important because throughout this, we're going to be thinking about natural resource conservation, and picking out the right turf is part of that process. Pollinator protection, probably the most obvious goal of a bee lawn. I'll keep it simple here. We're putting in flowers strategically to support pollinators. I get lots of questions of folks asking about the random lawn flowers in their yard, and some of them might have some value, some of them not so much. Here, the flowers selected for bee lawns were selected intentionally because of their high quality forage in the form of nectar and pollen. So we're looking at, from left to right, Dutch white clover, creeping thyme, and self-heal. And finally, bee lawns and stormwater conservation. And if you're looking at this slide and thinking to yourself, my goodness, that is not what I expected a bee lawn to look like, you would be exactly right. Where, as Tara mentioned before working for Twin Cities Seed, I worked for an organization called Metro Blooms, where their #1 thing was installing green infrastructure. And the most common planting that Metro Blooms installed was exactly what you see here, a rain garden. Where I think when folks think of how can I conserve water within my property, without a doubt, the first thing that experts will try to do is cite a rain garden. Where can I put a rain garden to capture as much stormwater runoff as possible? And I love rain gardens. I think they're fantastic. I've helped to design and install dozens, maybe even hundreds at this point. But the fact of the matter with the rain garden is even larger ones are only going to cover a few hundred square feet, whereas the average lawn space in Minnesota is measured in the thousands of square feet. So that means that there's just a ton of square footage where we could be doing better than the typical Kentucky bluegrass lawn where the roots are only 3 inches deep and you have to water it once or twice or even more times per week, depending on just how hot it gets here in Minnesota. And that's where bee lawns can come in. What are we doing with the rest of that space that is not being converted into a rain garden? And that's where I think bee lawns have a ton of potential, where the turf grasses we use in bee lawns have much deeper root systems. I'll talk about that turf grass species very soon, but also the flowers that are included in the bee lawn seed mix also have much deeper root systems. Those deeper root systems help to break up the soil, improve the infiltration into the soil. And what that means for you is that there's less stormwater running off your property, more of that stormwater being infiltrated into the ground. And for anyone that wants to improve their local water quality, that is so, so, so important. Where again, I don't view bee lawns as the one-stop solution to all of it, but think of it as just a tool you could put beside a rain garden, beside a native planting, to even further the infiltration you see on your property. So that kind of, I hope, gets everyone on the same page in terms of background info. Now I want to switch gears and talk about the elements or the building blocks of a bee lawn. So here throughout this section, I'm going to be talking a lot about the graduate student research of a student who came before me. His name is Ian Lane. I could give a whole separate 45-minute presentation about how great Ian is and how thankful I am to have had his help throughout this process. But I don't have enough time for that, so I'll simply go over the highlights of his research, and there is so much great info here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to kind of build a bee lawn from the bottom up, starting first with the turfgrass species that are best suited for bee lawns, then talking about the flowers that are best suited for bee lawns, and finally talking about the main focus of my project, and that is, once we go through all this work, what bees can we actually expect to see visiting our bee lawn flowers? What is the impact that bee lawns make? So let's talk some turf. So when we think about turfgrass from the point of view of conservation, we're typically thinking about the conservation of natural resources. How can we reduce irrigation, mowing, fertilizer applications, etc.? If we want to try and get flowers established alongside grasses, now we also have to think of our grasses as a biological competitor. What's going to let flowers into the lawn, and what is going to do and what kind of grasses would be less likely to let flowers into the lawn? So to put to help that make sense, I want to look through this little visual animation here, where if we were to first consider a turfgrass that's very aggressive, a fast rate of growth, a wider leaf blade, we would be creating a situation where it's very difficult for flowers to get established, where with that thick leaf blade and that fast rate of growth, we would expect low forb establishment, not too many flowers cracking through. On the other hand, if we're to consider a turfgrass species that has a thinner leaf blade and a slower rate of growth, we would figure that that would be a less competitive environment for the flowers that we're trying so hard to get established, and that we would see greater forb establishment. And this is exactly what Ian Lane tested. He took the four most common turfgrass species used in the United States: Kentucky bluegrass, hard fescue, which is a type of fine fescue, tall fescue, and perennial ryegrass. And he simply asked the question, how will a model flower, in this case Cura clover, very closely related to Dutch white clover, establish alongside each of these grasses? It looks like some of my reformatting didn't match up exactly perfect, but essentially the two top species there, the Kentucky bluegrass and the hard fescue, have thinner leaf blades and a slower rate of growth. And those two bottom species, the tall fescues and the perennial ryegrass, have wider leaf blades at a faster rate of growth. Where the hypothesis was that those two grasses with the thinner leaf blades and the slower rate of growth, less competitive, more flowers established with those. And the more aggressive turfgrass species, the tall fescue and the perennial ryegrass, we didn't expect to see as many blooming flowers within lawns planted with those two grasses. And that is exactly what Ian found. When measuring both leaf count and the number of blooms present in each grass species, those less competitive, those more slow-growing grasses really allowed far more flowers, almost 9 times as many flowers as compared to the more aggressive grasses, the perennial ryegrass and the tall fescue. So with that, sorry, I got the office phone still hooked up here, should have unplugged that. So with that, how did we choose which grass species was best? Ultimately, we selected the fine fescues because they are so low input. Kentucky bluegrasses, they love their fertilizer, they love their irrigation, they really take a lot of upkeep, but the fine fescues, much more sustainable for use. So that's ultimately what we recommend for use within a bee lawn. To get a sense of just how great these fine fescues are, I do want to take a minute or two to talk about them. So I mentioned before that some grasses differ in their fertilizer needs, and a fantastic example of that is when we compare fine fescues to Kentucky bluegrasses. So Kentucky bluegrasses, you want to put down about 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And when I hear that, in my mind, I'm thinking, wow, that is a ton of potential for that nitrogen to leach out and run off into nearby bodies of water. By comparison, fine fescues require about 0.5 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet on an annual basis. So we're talking 1/6 the fertilizer for the upkeep of fine fescues as compared to Kentucky bluegrasses. Where let's say at the end of this, you think, gosh, bee lawns sound great, but that might be a little bit too much work for me. If you simply take out the bluegrass and put in fine fescues, you are doing a great conservation plus for your local ecosystem. A little bit more about fine fescues. They are super slow growing. You only have to mow a fine fescue lawn 3 or 4 times per year. That will greatly reduce the amounts of emissions coming off of your lawn due to mowing. They do great in both sun or shade, and they also have fantastic drought tolerance. I tell folks that with, of course, some seasonal variation, if you mow fine fescues about once every 2 to 3 weeks, you should be in the clear. They do not require much water at all. The only main drawback I see with fine fescues is they have middling traffic tolerance. So if you just have regular recreation in your backyard, that's fine, don't even worry about it. But let's say you have a few bigger dogs or you have kids that really like to play back there, the fine fescue might struggle to hold up with all that foot traffic, especially abrasion from the nails of dogs. So now that we know which grasses are a good fit for bee lawns, let's talk about the floral species that are a really nice fit for bee lawns. What flowers work well with those grasses? And this again is more work from Ian Lane, where he evaluated a whole bunch of flowers. And actually the majority of the ones he tried were native, but as you'll see, not everything you try is a success. So we'll talk through the winners. So self-heal is an absolute favorite of mine from the flowers that are currently being used within bee lawns. It is a native wildflower, and I always like to try and think of things from a pollinator's point of view. I am 100% without a doubt a pollinator nerd, so I'm going to take you all with me on a little pollinator journey of thinking through these flowers, both from the human perspective, how they impact you as a manager of your lawn, and also how they interact with different pollinators, specifically bees. So when I look at the self-heal, the first thing that I notice is that long floral neck. And our expectation with this flower was that we would see mostly larger bees. When we think about what flowers are likely to be visited by what bees, when we see a flower that's more closed off, a whorled closed off bloom or a long floral neck, that means it's tough to get the rewards from it. You need a long bee tongue, and that typically means that you're going to have larger bees visiting you. Things like bumblebees, large megachilid bees, etc. But what you'll see in this picture here is we've got a mining bee here, an osmia, which is considered a smaller bee than what we anticipated. And we actually saw a lot of small bees on this flower. And the absolute best way I can describe how they are able to get these rewards is, my goodness, you would not believe how cute it is. Where what the bees do is they actually crawl into the flower, crawl down to that floral neck, get their rewards, crawl out, and fly away. This did mean a lot more work for me as a graduate student, where rather than just capturing the bees off the flowers, with the self-heal, I had to peel through every flower head and see, is there anyone in there? But it's great for the sense of supporting as many bees as possible. A wider bee community is able to be served through this behavior of those bees really crawling in, working hard to get their fill, so to say. Something that was very excited to me on the equation as the scientist going through this experiment is that the literature had suggested that self-heal was primarily a nectar source for bees, which of course is great, very important. Bees are generally nectar generalists. They'll go to any old flower for nectar, but we didn't know whether or not they used the self-heal flower for pollen. And we actually found evidence to suggest that bees were visiting self-heal for pollen. And what I want everyone to look at here is what we call combing behavior within this bumblebee, where as the bumblebee is foraging, let's see, there we go. As the bee is foraging, you'll see it really moving those bee legs around. And what it's doing is it's brushing pollen down into its pollen sacs. So because we saw this very clear pollen collecting behavior, we knew that bees were collecting pollen and not just nectar from this flower. Something else that I can never help myself from doing during these presentations is I can never resist a great chance for bumblebee ID. So let's take the old laser pointer here and teach you how to identify this bee species. So what you'll see is on the abdomen here, you'll see that yellow outline in the shape of a W. Let's say you're out on a walk and you see a bumblebee with that nice little outline. That is a dead giveaway for Bombus bimaculatus, one of my favorite bumblebee species. I probably say that about all of them. I pick lots of favorites, but a great bee species that we saw on self-heal quite a bit, and really a lot of the bee lawn flowers, so definitely a favorite. Okay, so moving on from the self-heal, so my last tidbit. So I know that there's a lot of information presented in this presentation, for lack of a better word. But if there's one takeaway that I want you to have from the self-heal, it's that more than 95% of the visitors, all but 3 visitors that we saw in self-heal, were native species. So if you want to put a flower species in your lawn that is specifically going to support native pollinators, self-heal is a fantastic option. We saw it just loaded with native bee species. The vast majority of those visitors were native. So now we're going to move on to another floral species, creeping thyme. If any of you have some gardening experience, you might be very familiar with creeping thyme. It is commonly used kind of within the cracks, like between tiles in folks' gardens, or even just as a garden plant by itself. But creeping thyme is a fantastic option for both small bees, for primarily small bees. But the thing that really sticks out to me about creeping thyme is when it blooms. So I do a lot of talks about just planting for pollinators across the board. And a phrase that I've probably used ad nauseum at this point is staggered bloom times. The idea that we don't need just early season blooms or late season blooms, we need blooms throughout the growing season. There is a ton that blooms in the middle of season. Think like June, July, August. But early in the season and late in the season, there's a bit of a dearth. Creeping thyme blooms very late into the growing season, sometimes as late as mid or late September. So what I loved about creeping thyme is that it is the latest to bloom of all the bee lawn flowers, and it's a fantastic late season source of forage for bees. You'll see all sorts of these gorgeous iridescent green sweat bees all over creeping thyme, as well as bees from other genera like Laceo-glossum, mostly medium and small bees on the creeping thyme. Moving on to Dutch white clover, one of my favorite flowers in the world. It is a fantastic for bees of all sizes. And really the key here is all tied to that bloom head, where the bloom head of Dutch white clover, it's composed of a bunch of little clovers that come together to make a globe-like flower. So if you're a small or medium-sized bee like this agapostemon on the flower pictured here, you're grabbing onto maybe one or a couple of those petals, grabbing your nectar, pollen, etc., and getting on your way. But if you're a larger bee, I've seen bumblebees that use the entire floral head as a landing pad. So that, just the way that those petals are situated, it allows for a great diversity of bees to obtain forage from Dutch white clover. And it's not just the fact that bees are visiting it. We also happen to know that the quality of the pollen and the quality of the nectar is super high. Lots of protein in the pollen, lots of sugar in the nectar, exactly what bees need. And Dutch white clover, gosh, it blooms for a long time. From May through early September, I've seen. And in general, another great facet of Dutch white clover is that it is from the legume family, meaning it is a nitrogen fixer. It takes that atmospheric nitrogen, brings it back to the soil. And for me, that means I don't have to apply as much fertilizer. Nitrogen is, by the way, for those who don't know, the most important nutrient that there is for plants that you're trying to get established in a lawn, in a garden, etc. And if there's one thing that I want folks to remember about Dutch white clover, it's that it is a critical forage source for both honeybees and native bees. So both our wild bees and our managed bees, honeybees and native bees. And in total, we saw more than 55 bee species on Dutch white clover in Minneapolis alone. And across all the bee lawn flowers, we saw more than 65 species. I have to update that last little factoid that you see on the graphic here, where I used to say that it's more than 15% of all bees in Minnesota. Our bee lab is too prolific for my own good here, where they've identified more species. So now it's somewhere between 10 and 15% of all of the bees in Minnesota that we've seen on those bee lawn flowers in Minneapolis. So that covers the original bee lawn mix. Just because I graduated as a student doesn't mean that I stopped caring about bee lawns, where something that I heard from so many folks in the pollinator conservation community was a desire for native options within the bee lawn world. So self-heal is a native option, but the creeping thyme and the Dutch clover are not. So I tried to work with growers to figure out what else can we not only establish in a bee lawn that's native, but what else is produced in a way where it's financially feasible to get the native flower in, where many native flowers can cost well over $1,000 per pound, and that's just never going to be something we can include in a bee lawn mix. So figuring out both what works for the bees and what works for our wallets. And we found that yak yarrow, very closely related to common yarrow, but growing much smaller, and blue-eyed grass are really nice options if you want more native flowers to consider within a bee lawn. And again, we're following that basic rule of thumb that native plants support our native pollinators. So yak yarrow is one that I am very passionate about, attractive to all sorts of pollinators, and really something that I find interesting about it is how drought tolerant this flower is. NTEP, the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, they conduct tests to figure out what are the most drought tolerant forms of vegetation we have access to. This includes turfgrass, wildflowers, etc. And yak yarrow, this species here, is one of the best options for just low input management lawns. And the key to that is this species thrives under drought limited scenarios, water limited scenarios because of its fantastic drought tolerance. So yak yarrow, a species I'm super excited about, one that I think is going to become more and more popular as more folks are looking for conservation friendly options within the lawn. Blue-eyed grass is another species that I am really excited about. One, I mean, my goodness, it's just beautiful. And two, it's attractive not only to bees and insect pollinators, but also to songbirds, where songbirds really like the seeds that it produces. As far as ease of management, this one is going to require the most upkeep. It requires a bit more water than the other bee lawn flowers, but it's beautiful and pollinators like it, so I think it's worth the work. Both the yak yarrow and the blue-eyed grass pictured here, they bloom a little bit taller than the other bee lawn flowers. These will start to bloom around the 6-inch height, the blue-eyed grass and the yak yarrow respectively. All the other bee lawn flowers are going to start to bloom right around 3 inches off the ground. For anyone with a difficult HOA, those low blooming heights on the flowers should help keep that in check, keep everyone happy. Another advantage of bee lawns that I always like to point out, I try to recognize, heck, some people are afraid of pollinators, some people are afraid of bees. My own parents are afraid of bees. They couldn't be more supportive of the work I do. They just don't want it themselves. But I'm yet to meet the resident who doesn't support local food. So there's a really great study out of Chicago that, gosh, I've been citing for 6 years now, where they found that converting just 5% of a lawn to something pollinator friendly can improve pollination and production at local urban gardens and local urban farms. So just a little bit of some literal food for thought for everyone here. So now let's take some time to talk about the actual installation and maintenance of bee lawns. We'll talk about the timing for this, overseeding versus a new lawn renovation, and the maintenance that's required for these. A little teaser there, these are so easy to maintain once they're established. Probably my favorite part of this is someone who would much rather watch baseball than do yard work. So timing, there are 3 windows of time that I would zone in on. The first being the early spring. So right after we get snow melt, we start to get those warm degree days, and what's called degree days begin to accumulate. That is when we would want to do a seeding like this. We want to get it in close after the snow melt, because once degree days start accumulating, once warmth starts accumulating, we're going to see weedy species starting to establish within the lawn. So for me, what I'll do is I'll do a bee lawn seeding early in the spring, late April, early May, depending on the year. And if there's any patchiness to the lawn, I'll supplement that with an overseeding in either the fall summer transition period or even as a dormant seeding later on in the year. The second option is to do a late summer seeding or seed during the transition from summer to fall. Here, what we have is just absolutely wonderful soil temperatures. We're going to get soil temperatures somewhere between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect for new vegetation growth. And here we would expect same year germination of the grasses and your flowers to likely overwinter and come in strong the following year. Here, if I were to do an overseeding, if I see some patchiness in those grasses that are coming up, I'll either overseed a little bit in the late fall or possibly the following spring to make sure that it establishes nice and dense. And finally, the way that I established all these as a grad student was as a dormant seeding, where we waited until the ground got nice and cool. We wanted soil temperatures right around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, where it's too cold for the plants to actually start growing, but the ground's not quite yet frozen. And the idea is you spread out the bee lawn seeds, they lie dormant through the fall and winter, and they come up the following spring. This is a really great option for the folks who don't want to have to worry too much about watering in their bee lawn, where the snow melt is going to provide a lot of that moisture. So there are two ways in which we can install a bee lawn. One option is an overseeding, where you're putting that bee lawn seed directly into your already established lawn. And the other option is a new lawn renovation. So different folks have different lawns. I'm going to cover both, but here is kind of a cheat sheet where an overseeding is a good fit for folks that have either a Kentucky bluegrass or fine fescue lawn with low weed infiltration. And a new lawn renovation is going to be better for folks that have some other grass type species in their lawn or a lawn that's really run over with weeds. So let's start with an overseeding because it is quite a bit more simple. So when to overseed, again, if you've got the right turfgrass species present, fine fescue or Kentucky blue, and if you have a limited or no weeds present in the lawn. So step one is you want to mow that lawn as short as possible. Step two, you want to rake away the clippings, and this is exceptionally important, where when you rake away those clippings, you expose the soil. And anytime we put seed down, whether it's turfgrass seed, whether it's bee lawn seed, or it's wildflower seed to start a prairie, if that seed does not hit the soil, you will not get germination in the establishment. So rake away those clippings to expose the soil. After that, you could spread your bee lawn seed mix. And then all you really have to do is water it in. What I tell folks is that if you put in 3 weeks of work, you make sure you keep that area moist for the first 3 weeks or so, you will have years upon years of easy lawn maintenance. In terms of maintenance, and we'll touch more on maintenance as we go on through this presentation, the main thing is to raise that mower. If you keep your mower blade at 3 inches or higher, you will have constant blooms within your bee lawn. And of course, no herbicides. You have just worked so hard to get these flowers established. Using herbicides will kill those flowers. So if you see something you really don't like, try and hand weed it out of there. So what happens if you have suboptimal, less than perfect turfgrass conditions? And that is where a new lawn renovation comes into play. Where yes, it's going to take more resources, either monetary or more elbow grease, more physical labor, but it is going to potentially see improved overall results. And the reason for that is you'll get perfect seed to soil contact ratios. That soil is going to be perfectly exposed, and dropping seed right onto it should get you some really strong germination. There we go. So let's talk about how we would go through one of those full lawn renovations, where step one is the removal of the turf grass or the removal of whatever vegetation it is you're trying to get rid of. This can be done with either simple machine tools like a shovel, or what we see on the right, a sod kicker. What I would say is any project where you're considering using a shovel, you spend $15 and rent a sod kicker. It will save you so much time. Your back will be thanking you the next day. You will literally cut through that grass so much easier. A sod cutter, couldn't recommend it enough. But in general, using these hand tools, I would recommend it for smaller projects, maybe 500 square feet or less if you're feeling a little ambitious. If you're doing a larger area, that's where I'd really recommend getting some stronger machinery, renting a sod cutter, even renting a mini excavator like a dingo pictured on the right. Those will just really rip right through that turf grass, make your day a lot easier, save you a lot of time and energy. What's also an option for you is using some of these cultural methods. I'm going to go through a couple of them, but what I'd really recommend doing is, if any of these cultural methods seem attractive to you, the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation has a fantastic guide to organic site preparation. A great scientist by the name of Sarah Foltz Jordan was instrumental to the creation of that guide. Couldn't recommend it enough. I'm going to give you the elevator pitch on 2 different strategies. That is, the all-encompassing guide to organic site prep. So solarization, you might have seen some neighbors trying to do this. They lay out that sheet of plastic over their yard, and you might have been thinking, how exactly does this work? So the basic idea is that when you put out that plastic, you're kind of creating like a little bit of a greenhouse effect within the lawn, where that area is going to collect so much heat over time to the point where it'll kill whatever vegetation is underneath the plastic. A rule to keep in mind here is that the more direct sunlight the area receives, the better. If you have a full sun area, you could do a solarization in 2 to 3 months. If you've got an area with a little bit of shade, 3 to 4 months. So something to keep in mind during the planning process. Another option that is probably going to be very familiar to those of you in the crowd here that are gardeners is a sheet mulching. With the sheet mulching, I affectionately call it lawn lasagna because you're pretty much putting down layers of compost and cardboard and soaking it in with water until you're smothering the area. That compost and cardboard will break down over time and give you a fantastic area to plant directly into. So here, you're not just smothering the grass, you're also remediating your soil, giving you a great area to plant it into. So again, just the little elevator pitches on two different options for cultural methods of getting rid of vegetation, but they work great. And if you want more info, check out that organic guide to site preparation. Believe it or not, there actually is some science behind how to seed a lawn. I recommend folks do a perpendicular seeding. What that means is you're going to spread half the full rate going in the east-west direction and half of the rate going in the north-south direction. To kind of give you some a more clear example, bee lawns are typically spread at 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. If I were helping you install this in your yard, we would spread half of it, 2.5 pounds walking east-west, and we would spread the other half, 2.5 pounds walking north-south. After you put the seed down, lightly rake it into the soil. Raking in general is really helpful. Breaking up the soil is helpful. Seeds like what's called a soft landing, soft soil to get established into. So doing anything to break up compaction, definitely a win. After that, you're going to do one heavy watering, and then you're going to implement what is so crucial, what we call a light and frequent watering program, where if you can water twice a day, very light amount, maybe a quarter inch or so for the first 3 weeks, that is what your bee lawn is going to need to get established. And from there on out, once it's fully established and mature, super easy to maintain. So how that'll look, you remove that turf by hand, machine, or cultural method. You add a soil amendment if needed. I always recommend folks get a soil test and add an amendment based on the results. Then you can put the seed down, lightly raking it in. Don't submerge the seeding, just a little light raking over the top. Me personally, this one's optional, but I like to cover it with a germination blanket. Those blankets you'll see like on MnDOT projects alongside highways, rights of way, things like that. And then just keep it moist until sprouting and maintain it a little bit higher than you normally would and no herbicides. If any of you have a computer that allows you to do a screenshot, here's a little slide summarizing overseeding versus new lawn renovation that I like to put in here just as something you can fall back on. Let's say, it's late April, early May, you want to make this a reality and you're trying to decide between an overseeding or a new lawn renovation. This lays out the conditions, the mix options, and the benefits of each for you. So a quick little section on ongoing maintenance. I say quick because bee lawns are super low maintenance. So plant establishment, again, this is the most important part. We are watering frequently, daily, even twice a day if you can. And even after that critical establishment period, if you can water through the first year, maybe once or twice per week, you will be well on the way to maturity, where every following year, you can cut back the watering like crazy. And maybe do a little bit of weeding in the first year just to make sure your bee lawn doesn't get overtaken by some aggressive weedy species. Mowing. Mowing is something that you will be able to relax on quite a bit. Most folks mow about every 7 to 10 days. With a bee lawn, I would mow it 3 to 4 times per year. I personally like to do a height-based mowing. I let it grow out to 6 inches, cut it back to 4 inches. This ensures that I have a lot of blooms in the landscape. Fertilizer, me personally, I never fertilize bee lawns. The low input fine fescue doesn't need fertilizer too much. And if it does need some fertilizer, the Dutch white clover is going to do is going to bring in enough nitrogen where fertilizer really not too important here. Irrigation, once a bee lawn is mature, so after we get into the second year, maybe water it once every 2 to 3 weeks, a little bit more in the heat of summer in July or so, less when things are cooler in April, May, September, October. Thatch removal, this is one thing that I would recommend adding, especially if you're going to cut down on how frequently you mow. If you let your bee lawn grow out more, you're going to have more buildup of dead plant material that we call thatch. If you run a dethatcher once per season in the spring after the spring greenup, you'll get that thatch out of the way. It'll take you an hour or so. In the end, you come out way ahead in terms of how much work you're putting into your lawn. And with that, we can jump into questions.
And good thing we have many questions for you, James.
I'm here for it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. You did a great job presenting, really giving us a science-based outlook on how to take our lawns to the next level as pollinator habitat. So thank you so much. We have a lot of similar questions, so I've been trying to kind of group them together and make it a valuable experience for everyone. So one of the most popular questions, we're talking about like the no mow May, where a lot of these plants that you had suggested were blooming at about 6 inches. What do you suggest for people that live in cities or towns that legislate how tall the lawn can be? Have you ever seen municipalities push back on these more natural lawns?
Yeah, I have seen a few municipalities push back, not necessarily on bee lawns, but I saw when I was administrating the Lawns to Legumes program, where there's a couple counties, and I will try to bite my tongue as best I can, that have outlawed Lawns to Legumes projects within them, or a couple neighborhoods, I shouldn't say counties, but you can imagine how someone with my background would feel about that. But what I will say about bee lawns is they are very HOA friendly, where the original bee lawn mix, the Dutch clover, the creeping thyme, and the self-heal, those flowers actually bloom at 3 inches. It's only those 2 additional native flowers that start to bloom at 6 inches or taller. And gosh, I'd imagine just about any HOA should allow for that 3 to 6 inch range. Where there is a little bit of gray area is with quote unquote weeds in the lawn. And I say weed with quotes because what is a weed is all perception, where what someone else sees as a weed, what person A sees as a weed, person B might see as a wildflower. So me personally, that would be my stance, where I don't view a flower as a weed if it provides high quality forage for wildflowers. But whether or not your HOA will agree with that, TBD. But if anyone ever needs help fighting their HOA, I will freelance that. So feel free to bring me in, and I'll bring the firepower.
Knowing our audience, they might take you up on that suggestion.
I encourage it.
You had kind of answered a lot of these questions in your talk. Let's go on to what are your recommendations for planting a bee lawn with plants that we know are weeds, like quackgrass, creeping Charlie, foxtail. That's what a lot of our audience members have been talking about. Are there specific competitive plants they can focus planting?
I get that question a lot, where the answer that everyone's hoping for is put down the bee lawn mix, it'll outcompete all those guys. But unfortunately, those weeds are common lawn weeds for a reason. They are highly competitive, they are highly aggressive, where it's really going to limit the success of your establishment if you try to put in a bee lawn mix alongside highly competitive weeds like the grass you said, crabgrass, but also forb species, wildflower species like creeping Charlie, for example. That's probably the most common question I get is how does creeping Charlie fit into the equation? But the fact of the matter is those really aggressive species do have the potential to outcompete the bee lawn, wildflowers, and grasses.
Oh, good to hear. As we've had some droughts these past couple of years, does this type of lawn stand up to a drought?
This is like the question that I dream of. You would think I paid this person off. So bee lawns are super drought tolerant. They are drought friendly plantings. So here I work for a seed company, Twin City Seed. And typically what folks desire is, I want the greenest, most beautiful lawn in my block, things that I personally find a little boring, but that's besides the point. But now with these past 2 years, 2021 and 2022, there is an emphasis placed on drought tolerance. And the key to drought tolerance is root depth, where the bee lawn flowers and the turf grasses, specifically the fine fescues used in the bee lawn mix, super drought tolerant because of how deep those roots reach. So if you think about Kentucky bluegrass, the general rule of thumb is the roots are as long as the height you let grow out. So let's say you're super adventurous, you let your lawn grow out to 6 inches, your root system is probably right around 6 inches, maybe a bit longer than that. With the grasses and wildflowers using the bee lawn mix, you're measuring the root depth in feet. That really lends to being able to draw water from much deeper into the ground. Bee lawns, I'd water them once every 2 to 3 weeks once they're fully established, really strong drought tolerance.
Let's hope we don't have another drought, but in the case that we do,
Mhm.
we'll be prepared. Do bee lawns tend to spread easily, for example, to another neighbor's yard?
So what I've seen is that the flowers and grasses included in the bee lawn mix, they can spread a little bit throughout turf grass areas. They will not spread into and overtake wildflower plantings. There's a potential for some spread. What I would do is if you have a neighbor that you know is going to be not too pleased with your bee lawn, having some sort of like barrier, impervious surface of sorts will be your best friend. What I've seen some people do is use either like a rock edging or a mulch edging or even just like a plastic edging to help limit the spread of the flowers and grasses in the bee lawn mix.
So we're all good neighbors to each other.
Mhm.
Let's see. Do you have any examples of homeowners associations that have successfully adopted the approach of bee lawns?
So, sort of. So one of the things that Bowser, the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, did through lawns to legumes, where bee lawns were an approved planting type within the program, is they created what they called a sample ordinance for cities that wanted to allow their residents to participate in lawns to legumes. And if you go on the Bowser Lawns to Legumes website, you can see what one of those ordinances looks like. So this will not be specific to bee lawns, but more the broader, how can I adapt my HOA to what residents are now demanding, which is these more conservation-friendly practices. Tara, if you want, I could send you that PDF after the fact. If you already are very familiar with lawns to legumes and know where to go for it, then maybe you don't need my help there.
No, that'd be great. We'll send that out in the resource email on Friday. So as many resources as possible for this group of people.
Mhm.
Is there a minimum amount of sun that bee lawns need?
Yeah, I would say 6 hours or more of sunlight, you're generally safe. And this is one that's going to vary from flower species to flower species. The Dutch white clover does well in full and part sun. The self-heal actually does best with a little bit of shade. I would call it a part sunflower that also does pretty good in full sun. I've had it established no problem in sunny soils, just took a little bit more water maybe to keep it going. And the creeping time is a full sun plant. So if you have a shade to part shade yard, I'd expect some clover and some self-heal. In fact, if you look at my background image, this was at a pretty shady site, so you can see it took off real nice. And if you're in full sun, it's going to be mostly the clover and the thyme. What's really interesting is seeing how different a bee lawn looks in different parts of the state, where here in the Twin Cities, well, here is very relative, but for me out in the Twin Cities, I see the clover and the self-heal almost every single time. The creeping time varies based on soil type and sun. But if you go out into the Anoka sand plains, it's that creeping time that is really the dominant flower. So as with any planting, it's going to be a little bit dependent on what your local little microclimate looks like in your yard.
Perfect. Here's another good question. They just keep rolling in.
Mhm.
Can you leave fall leaves on a bee lawn and to what depth?
So this kind of goes for any planting, not just a bee lawn. There's the potential to smother your lawn, in which case it will have a negative impact on it. But if you either leave some scattered leaves or maybe you potentially mulch them, I know there's mixed opinions on that because you don't want to harm any insects that may be in the leaf litter. But what I do is I like to rake some of it into a garden bed and leave some to break down into the lawn, where I would say leave the leaves as a net positive until you tip over that threshold of smothering your lawn.
Perfect. Do you have any experience with pests like jumping worms, Japanese beetles, and how to handle them in bee lawns?
It would be no different than any. Okay, so for the jumping worms, no different than any other scenario, bee lawn, garden, etc., where that's really primarily an issue with like bringing in soils and soil amendments, and even I think to an extent a little bit in mulch, but primarily the soil amendments. They've been seeing the jumping worms. I definitely do see Japanese beetle on the Dutch white clover at a minimum within the bee lawn mix. But gosh, I mean, anyone who's had their battles with Japanese beetle knows those things just go everywhere. There's a little bit of a cyclical nature to the Japanese beetle, where some years you'll have a ton of them, some years not so much. It's a little hit or miss there, but I've definitely seen quite a few on the Dutch clover at a minimum.
Wonderful. Would this approach be beneficial to retention ponds where it's not as practical to add like a traditional native buffer to help with this water capture?
I would say the level of water that you typically see within a retention pond is above what I would recommend for a bee lawn, where and it's something that I deal with directly through work, not with bee lawns, just with making general planting recommendations, where there's MnDOT mixes that are much better suited for that use, where I would always be going with the mixes MnDOT recommends for that situation rather than a bee lawn there. You're probably just going to swamp it out.
How do bee lawns perform on hillsides, and how would you establish that?
A really great fit, in fact, and that's another one that ties right into the deep roots. If you want to have a planting that does well along a hillside, deep roots is a big help. And I would say your best friend when establishing a bee lawn or any planting across the board, your best friend is going to be a germination blanket, where the reality is, if you put seed down on a hill, whether it be bee lawn or any other seed, if you get one strong gust of wind or one rain event, you're probably dealing with a washout or wind blowing that seed all over the place. If you put a germination blanket down, it helps keep the seed in place, and you're going to have much more success.
Great. So we might have torrential rain as well as drought. So we'll be prepared for anything. We have a couple of questions about people asking about what is this beautiful iridescent bee that you have on your screen right now?
That's Agapostum texanus. You might not be surprised to hear that it's my favorite bee species. That's why it gets to be on the screen for the longest amount of time. I also don't think everyone realizes that you could have beautiful iridescent green bees like this. So bee awareness.
Awareness. Perfect. Oh, here's another good one. Is there any work with Minnesota Department of Transportation to do bee lawn mixes along the roads, especially after they do work or with new roads?
Gosh, I know it's been a discussion, but I don't know if it's ever been more than a discussion. They just redid some of their recommended mixes this past year, and bee lawns did not break into that conversation. So I think not now, but hopefully in the future.
Fingers crossed.
Amen.
We do have a comment from Howard. He said, James, if you get a chance, please mention our landscape revival events in early June. Would you like to talk about that a bit?
Is that Howard Marcus? I'm 98% sure it is.
Yes.
But yeah, that is the least I could do considering how great of a resource Howard's been, not just to me, but to Lawns to Legumes, which even though I'm not an admin anymore, still I like to consider myself a #1 fan. Landscape revival. If you are looking for native plants that you know that you want to be certain they're not treated with pesticides, herbicides, neonics, you want to make sure you're supporting your local community garden centers and native plant producers. Landscape revival typically has 2 native plant sales per year. Last year was my first year as an attendee, as a vendor rather than just kind of a volunteer. And so it was the first year that they had bee lawn present, and there was a ton of interest. So Twin City Seed will be there with bee lawn, Minnesota Native Landscapes is generally there, Glacial Ridge, just a fantastic resource for getting pollinator-friendly plants that will not be treated with any sort of pollinator harming chemical.
Perfect. We're at 2:30, so I do want to launch your after presentation poll. We just have some feedback we'd like to get about James's presentation. Everyone's questions have been so great, and James, you did it did a great job at actually answering a lot of the questions during your presentation. So super thorough. We want to thank you as the presenter, as well as the audience members for asking all these great questions. And we really appreciate your feedback on the poll. So pretty much this concludes our second session of the Pollinator Habitat webinar series. Hopefully we will see you all tomorrow for the next presentation on prairie plantings. So if you could just answer these few quick questions, we'd really appreciate it. And James, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, one, I always appreciate whenever folks hang out with me to talk bee lawns. And Tara, if possible, feel free